Yes.
You've brought a witness to court today who believes he is the baby's father. You did not father her 5-month-old daughter, Loyal. Ms. Loving, you admit that Mr. White wasn't your only sexual relationship, but say you can prove he is Loyal's biological.
I mean, Your Honor, we never did have a relationship. Like, for 4 years, I known Tiana. We were good friends, but we were never in a relationship, Your Honor.
But you had a sexual relationship.
Yes, ma'am.
Going on dates.
Correct.
Meeting his mom, calling his mom.
Correct.
You're calling my mom.
Correct.
I'm meeting your brothers. I took you to a family reunion.
Correct.
But I'm not your girlfriend.
But clearly you were in a sexual relationship.
Correct, yeah,
Were you using, so you're sleeping with a girl
with no
unprotected
protection,
that's
but
not
your girlfriend.
Correct.
So she says you're the only possible father.
Yes.
Do you believe that when she says it?
No, man, I didn't believe that, but I'm still trying to get her the benefit of the doubt because we were good friends.
What reason would you have not to believe her?
Because we already had a talk, you know, this supposed to been a one-time thing.
Told him on Facebook in August that it was a 50-50 chance.
Your Honor, I never knew there was a 50-50 chance.
Yes, you did, because when you came to the hospital, Will, I showed you.
When truth hides behind love, lies, and loyalty, only science and justice can uncover it. In a world where emotions cloud evidence and relationships rewrite the law, one DNA test can change everything, and not always for the better. Every story of truth begins with denial. In this case, the denial was not of love, but of fatherhood. It began with a single Facebook message, a place meant for memories and reconnections, not revelations that could destroy lives. You might be the father. 6 words that unravel years of silence, trust, and perception. It was a digital whisper that brought a man named Mr. White into a courtroom filled with doubt, DNA kits, and the haunting echo of past decisions. Mr. White never imagined his name would be tied to a paternity case. To him, what had once been friendship blurred briefly into intimacy, but not commitment. Yet, as life often reminds us, consequences are never bound by intention. When he learned of a pregnancy months later, confusion collided with guilt. He wanted answers, not through confrontation, but through truth. And in his world, truth meant evidence, a simple test, a piece of science that could rewrite destiny. But behind every DNA test people regret taking lies a human story. For some, these tests restore peace. For others, they ignite chaos. The power of genetic truth is both healing and devastating. It does not bend to emotion or circumstance. That's what makes this story so deeply human. As the courtroom filled with witnesses, mothers, and uncertain hearts, the law stood quietly between them all, unbiased, cold, and waiting. This is where the relationship between law and justice becomes most fragile. Law can determine a father, but only justice can restore a soul. The two do not always align, and this dissonance is what makes paternity cases so compelling, so painful. While the court's cameras captured the faces of the living, it was the unseen weight of truth that held everyone captive. For the mother, Ms. Loving, truth was a burden. For Mr. White, it was a necessity. And for the child, innocent, unnamed in her own drama, it was destiny. When emotions rise, the law does not move faster, it moves clearer. The evidence stage in divorce case or paternity trial is where facts replace feelings. This is the same stage where podcasts like the game-changing Attorney podcast often draw parallels between real-life disputes and the courtroom philosophies that shape them. The idea that truth changes everything is not just a slogan, it's a verdict waiting to be delivered. In Truth Changes Everything podcast, stories like this remind listeners that every test, every affidavit, and every witness statement carries the potential to rewrite an entire family's history. What seems like a simple DNA result is, in fact, the endpoint of a moral marathon. The pursuit of clarity through pain. Mr. White had brought his own DNA test to the hospital, a quiet act of courage, some might say, or desperation, others would argue. But Ms. Loving refused. The fragile piece of childbirth wasn't ready for confrontation. What began as hesitation grew into suspicion. What was once friendship began to feel like betrayal. Behind every modern paternity dispute, there lies a subtle reflection of the concept of justice in jurisprudence. The idea that truth must not only exist, but but must be proven. Justice cannot live on assumption. It must be anchored in evidence, even when that evidence wounds the innocent. The case unfolded not just in the courtroom, but in the collective conscience of those watching. On shows like the Divorce Course podcast, the discussion often turns to how law interprets morality. Can a father's love be judged by genetics alone? Can absence be forgiven if it was built on false belief? These are not legal questions. They are human ones. As the testimonies poured in, the courtroom became a mirror of modern family dynamics. The mother's own family believed one man was the father. The alleged father's mother doubted it, citing family traits and intuition. And then came another man, another possibility, another truth. He too believed he might be the father, bringing with him pictures and memories that aligned eerily with biology. This wasn't just one of those DNA test cheating stories that circulate on social media for shock value. This was real life, where every decision had a pulse and every revelation could shatter a home. When the results were read, silence fell like judgment itself. The truth was undeniable, and it did not favor Mr. White. The other man, Mr. Talbot, was declared the biological father. Justice had spoken, but peace did not follow. And this is where the deeper story begins, not in the verdict, but in the aftermath. For what happens when truth is finally revealed? What happens when science ends the debate, but hearts remain unconvinced? The answer lies in recovery, forgiveness, and transformation. That's why stories like these resonate with programs like Celebrate Recovery Testimonies, where people stand up not to justify their past, but to reclaim their present. Every broken relationship, every courtroom confession becomes a chance for redemption. Because the journey toward truth often exposes more than lies. It reveals our capacity to forgive, to rebuild, and to evolve. Meanwhile, the law continues to interpret evidence. Courts across the world wrestle with similar dilemmas. How much weight should be given to DNA versus intent, to proof versus emotion? Legal scholars and podcasts alike, from the Divorce Course podcast to the Game Changing Attorney podcast, explore how the Adverse Inference in Evidence Act plays into modern family law. When one party refuses a test or withholds information, courts can infer guilt or deception. Yet that inference, though logical, does not always reflect emotional truth. This tension, the pull between heart and law, is the essence of the human condition. It's what makes jurisprudence more than theory. The concept of justice in jurisprudence isn't about perfection. It's about pursuit. It's about how imperfect people navigate perfect laws. As the episode drew to a close, the courtroom was left with mixed emotions. Some cried for closure, others wept for the loss of illusion. The truth, though clear, carried the weight of finality. Mr. White was free from obligation, but not from emotion. He had been ready to take responsibility, ready to stand as a father, not out of guilt, but out of love. The DNA test had cleared him legally, but left him morally conflicted. Outside the courtroom, conversations continued among families, online communities, and in countless homes where viewers debated what they would have done. The story became a social study on how modern relationships intersect with science, technology, and the law. In this reflection lies the spirit of Truth Changes. Everything Podcast. A reminder that when justice speaks, lives are rewritten. The voice of reason often sounds cold, but within it lies the seed of renewal. And in the wider legal world, such cases find echoes in the Supreme Court child support rulings. Cases where paternity tests redefine financial and emotional responsibilities. The line between right and wrong becomes thinner, the cost of truth heavier. Yet for every story of loss, there is one of hope. Just as Adoption Stories full episodes remind us, families can be chosen as much as they are born. Love is not limited by DNA. It transcends science, just as forgiveness transcends guilt. Mr. White's journey was not about proving innocence. It was about confronting truth. He learned that closure is not granted by results, but by acceptance. Justice is not simply served, it is understood. In the end, this is more than a courtroom story. It's a meditation on truth, recovery, and the fragility of human relationships. It's about how every action, every word, and every test carries a ripple that extends far beyond the moment. When the curtain falls on the legal drama, life continues, and that's where the real verdict lies. The courtroom may have fallen silent, but the echoes of truth continued to vibrate through every heart that had witnessed it. For Mr. White, it wasn't just a legal ending, it was an emotional reckoning. The DNA test had spoken, but what it didn't say was how to heal from being almost a father. It didn't say how to forget the months of wondering, of imagining a life that wasn't his to claim. It didn't explain how to forgive a woman who hid behind confusion, or how to let go of a child he had begun to love in secret. These are the silent aftermaths of truth, the untold consequences of a DNA test people regret taking. Because sometimes clarity hurts more than doubt ever did. For every story of justice, there's another of heartbreak. And this is where truth reveals its complexity. It sets you free, but it never promises comfort. In the following weeks, the story became a topic of national conversation. Talk shows and podcasts picked it apart, dissecting the psychology behind betrayal, the weight of evidence, and the morality of modern relationships. On the Divorce Course podcast, legal experts debated how emotional honesty intersects with legal truth. They discussed how a simple DNA test could alter the trajectory of an entire family, and how the evidence stage in divorce case or custody battle often becomes the battlefield for hidden pain. Listeners of the Game Changing Attorney podcast found parallels in the case. How even attorneys, while defending clients, grapple with their own moral compass. The host spoke about how the relationship between law and justice is one of the oldest dilemmas in human civilization. Law seeks order, but justice seeks understanding. When the two diverge, truth becomes a bridge between what's right and what's fair. For Mr. White, that divergence became personal. The law had cleared him, justice had left him hollow. In the quiet of his thoughts, he replayed moments that now felt like illusions. The phone calls, the laughter, the way he had been called family by someone who would later doubt him. It was as though he had been living in a house built on trust, only to realize the foundation was made of sand. But even in this turmoil, there is learning. Life's harshest verdicts often become its greatest teachers. That's what makes stories like these so powerful on platforms like Truth Changes Everything podcast. There, real people share how a single revelation, whether through science, faith, or confrontation, reshapes everything they believed about themselves and others. The show's core message resonates deeply here. Truth may break you, but it also rebuilds you stronger. In one of its episodes, Truth Changes Everything, podcast explored how families recovering from deception often find healing not in blame, but in empathy. They referenced real cases like Mr. White's as examples of how the truth challenges the human heart to evolve. It's not about who was right, it's about who grows after the truth is known. As the legal dust settled, the public turned its attention to the broader implications of DNA testing in family law. The courtroom had proven once again that while science can reveal facts, it cannot define relationships. Legal scholars began revisiting the concept of justice in jurisprudence, emphasizing how courts must balance emotional realities with evidentiary truths. The DNA doesn't lie, but it doesn't explain either. In law schools and discussion forums, terms like adverse inference in evidence act surfaced again, particularly in debates about refusal of testing. Should the court interpret refusal as guilt? Should fear or emotional trauma ever outweigh the right to truth? The answer, as many legal experts concluded, depends not just on law, but on humanity. One guest speaker on the Game Changing Attorney podcast summarized it best. Justice isn't blind, it's conflicted. The court can determine fatherhood, but it cannot legislate love. It can order Supreme Court child support, but it cannot compel a bond between hearts. That paradox lies at the core of every family dispute where truth and affection are at war. Ms. Loving, the mother in this story, was no villain. Her hesitation came from fear, the fear of judgment, the fear of choosing wrong, the fear of facing her own contradictions. She lived between two possibilities, caught between memory and mistake. To her, silence was safety, but silence, as this story proved, is its own kind of betrayal. In emotional recovery groups like those highlighted in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, participants often share similar fears. They speak of the pain that comes from avoiding truth, of the wounds caused by lies told to protect others. Their testimonies remind us that healing begins the moment one stops defending the past. Like Ms. Loving, many realize that the hardest part of confession isn't being judged. It's seeing oneself honestly for the first time. Mr. Talbot, the biological father, now stood where Mr. White once did. For him, the truth was both a blessing and a burden. To be declared a father by science is a victory in fact, but a challenge in spirit. He had known the child briefly, almost from a distance, unsure of his place in her world. Now, the law had given him both a title and a duty, but love cannot be legislated. It must be built, moment by moment. This theme of earned fatherhood versus assigned fatherhood echoes deeply in Adoption Stories' full episodes. These narratives explore how families are not defined by blood but by choice, by compassion, by commitment. Biology may start a story, but love is what completes it. For the grandmother who once hoped Mr. White was the father, the truth was bittersweet. She had seen in him a reflection of stability and kindness, qualities she wanted for her daughter and granddaughter. When the test proved otherwise, her heart broke not for the science, but for the story that could have been. That's the unspoken tragedy of truth. It doesn't cater to hope. As viewers discussed the case online, one comment went viral. DNA gave them facts. God will have to give them peace. It was simple, but it captured everything this story represented. The separation between truth and peace, between knowledge and acceptance. Meanwhile, legal analysts pointed out how the case represented a modern intersection between technology, morality, and jurisprudence. It wasn't just about a child's paternity, it was about the evolving identity of family itself. In earlier decades, such disputes might have remained buried under shame or assumption. Today, with instant communication, home DNA kits, and televised courtrooms, the private has become public, and the truth has become entertainment. And yet, amidst this spectacle, the human lessons remain timeless. The relationship between law and justice will always test the boundaries of empathy. The court may close its file once the verdict is read, but the emotional file remains open forever. For every parent who loses or gains a child through law, there's a lifetime of reflection that follows. In the Divorce Course podcast, a recurring topic is the emotional residue of legal separation. One episode compared the courtroom process to emotional surgery. It removes what's diseased, but leaves scars that take time to heal. The host reflected that justice may be immediate, but healing is never rushed. This perfectly mirrors what unfolded in this story. The truth came swiftly, but the hearts involved would need years to reconcile with it. Even the broader public began questioning how much power we've given DNA in defining identity. Are we more than our genetics? What if the man who wasn't the father had been the only one willing to stay? What if love, not lineage, was the real test? Philosophers of law would call this moral paradox a jurisprudential conflict. When truth and compassion cannot coexist without one diminishing the other, the concept of justice in jurisprudence often circles back to this. That fairness and mercy, though both noble, do not always share the same path. In this light, Mr. White's story becomes larger than himself. It represents the countless men and women who have sought truth only to find pain, the families who believed that certainty would bring closure, and the children who grow up in the crossfire of emotion and legality. And yet, within that pain, there lies purpose. Just as the Celebrate Recovery testimonies remind us, the journey of redemption begins not after the verdict, but after acceptance. Acceptance of the truth, acceptance of oneself, acceptance that justice, no matter how precise, is never perfect. Weeks later, Mr. White began volunteering at a local family law clinic, quietly helping men understand their rights in paternity disputes. He spoke softly, never mentioning his own case, but his empathy was unmistakable. For him, justice had evolved. It was no longer about being right, but about helping others find peace through clarity. He had learned that being wronged by truth is better than living chained to illusion. The emotional ripple of his story reached beyond television. Listeners of Truth Changes. Everything Podcast wrote letters, thanking the show for highlighting stories that remind us how fragile and beautiful honesty can be. One listener wrote, "We think DNA exposes lies, but really it exposes hearts." In time, Ms. Loving too began to heal. Through counseling and faith-based groups, she learned to forgive herself for the confusion she caused. Her story was shared during a special session of Celebrate Recovery testimonies, where she spoke about learning to tell the truth. Not because it's easy, but because it's freeing. By the end of that year, both Mr. White and Ms. Loving had stopped appearing in headlines. The world had moved on, but the lessons remained. Truth cannot be undone, only lived through. And in a quiet way, justice had been served, not by the court, but by the courage it took to face reality. The truth had been spoken, the verdict delivered, and the cameras turned off. Yet the real story was only beginning. What happens after the courtroom lights dim? What happens when the people whose lives were dissected before the world have to return to the quiet rhythms of ordinary days? For Mr. White, silence became both refuge and punishment. He had spent months waiting for answers, building hope on a fragile thread of faith. When the DNA results shattered that illusion, he discovered something no court could prepare him for: the emptiness of being proven right and still feeling wrong. There was no celebration in the truth, only a deep understanding that knowledge often comes at the cost of peace. In the weeks that followed, his name trended on social media, his face replayed on reruns, his story analyzed by millions of strangers. But to him, it was never entertainment. It was a wound. People debated his choices, questioned his emotions, and theorized about his motives. Some said he dodged a lifetime of responsibility. Others said he lost a child who wasn't his by blood but might have been his by heart. Both sides were right. That's the paradox of cases like this. When law and life collide, there are no perfect outcomes. The relationship between law and justice becomes painfully visible. The law declared him not the father. Justice, however, demanded that he process what that meant to his soul. It was around this time that the Game Changing Attorney podcast featured an episode discussing paternity disputes and emotional accountability. The guest attorney spoke about how clients like Mr. White often leave the courtroom victorious in law but defeated in spirit. Legal victory, they argued, doesn't always align with emotional closure. The host reflected on how jurisprudence walks a thin line between correction and compassion, echoing an old truth. The law solves problems, but justice heals people. Meanwhile, Ms. Loving found herself caught between guilt and gratitude. She had longed for clarity, but underestimated how heavy it would feel. She had lied, not out of malice, but out of fear. Fear of losing control, of being judged, of facing two men whose lives she had entangled in her confusion. And though the DNA result had freed one and bound another, it did not absolve her from the emotional consequences. She turned to faith-based programs for strength, sharing her journey in Celebrate Recovery testimonies, speaking softly about her mistakes. She talked about how truth had humbled her, how it stripped away every defense she had built. Her words became a quiet beacon for others. You can't heal while hiding. In her testimony, she shared something that struck many listeners, that truth is like fire. It burns away the falsehood, but it also warms the heart once it's done. The audience fell silent as she described seeing her child now not as a source of guilt, but as a reminder of grace. The DNA test, had not destroyed her family. It had rebuilt it, differently, honestly. At the same time, the case drew the attention of legal scholars studying the concept of justice in jurisprudence. They saw in it a microcosm of modern society, where science can reveal truth faster than emotions can process it, and where courts are asked to navigate between human vulnerability and digital evidence. For them, this was not just a family dispute, it was a lesson in how justice must evolve with technology and empathy. Discussions on Truth Changes, Everything Podcast and the Divorce Course Podcast delved deeper into these themes. The hosts spoke about how the evidence stage in divorce case or custody proceedings often exposes not just facts, but the rawest emotions. They examined how adverse inference in Evidence Act provisions, like when someone refuses a DNA test, often highlight deeper fears than guilt, fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of being defined by proof instead of humanity. Listeners connected deeply with these ideas, flooding social media with personal reflections. Some shared their own DNA test cheating stories. Others revealed they had taken at-home tests and uncovered hidden siblings, infidelities, or adoptions. The sentiment was clear. DNA may clarify lineage, but it complicates love. And in that complexity lies the essence of the human condition. The more we learn, the less certain we become of what matters most. Months later, Mr. White was invited to share his story anonymously on Truth Changes Everything podcast. He agreed, not to relive his pain, but to reclaim his peace. His voice, steady but reflective, carried the weight of experience. When the test came back, he said, I thought I'd feel free, but I realized freedom without closure feels like floating without direction. It's not the truth that hurts, it's what the truth takes away. The episode became one of the most replayed that season, inspiring thousands who had faced similar reckonings. Listeners wrote in, sharing how his vulnerability helped them confront their own truths with parents,